Rebecca walked into the giant council room with her head held high and her hands steady at her sides, but inside her heart was beating fast like a drum during a storm, because she knew what was coming, and she had prepared herself for this moment. For 3 long years of watching her people get pushed around and ignored by species that thought they were better just because they had been in space, longer than humans, the room was so big that Rebecca could barely see the far wall and the ceiling. Showed pictures of stars and galaxies that moved and swirled like a living painting, and all around her sat the representatives of 200 different alien species in chairs that floated, or stood on platforms that adjusted to their different body types and needs. The elven matriarch sat on the highest platform in the center of the room, and her silver hair fell down past her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight, and her eyes were the color of ancient forests. And when she looked at Rebecca, there was no warmth in that gaze, only cold judgment that made Rebecca feel like she was a child being scolded by a teacher who had already decided she was guilty. Next to the matriarch sat Thesa, who was one of the Veltari representatives, and her green skin seemed to glow under the lights, and she had 3 eyes that could each look in different directions at the same time and right. Now all 3 of those eyes were focused on Rebecca with an expression that clearly said, "Humans were not welcome here and never would." Rebecca took her place at the human podium, which was smaller than most of the other podiums and positioned lower than the platforms where the important species sat. And this had bothered her when she first arrived 3 years ago, but now she understood. It was intentional because the council wanted humans to know their place at the bottom of the hierarchy. The matriarch stood up, and her robes shimmered with colors that seemed to change based on what she was thinking, and right now they were dark purple, which Rebecca had learned meant displeasure and stern judgment. The matriarch began to speak, and her voice filled the entire room without needing any microphone or speaker system, because elven voices could do that naturally. And she said that the council had made its final decision regarding the human expansion into the outer territories, and that decision was not going to make Earth happy. Rebecca listened as the matriarch explained that humanity would need to give up 17 colony worlds to the Veltari collective as payment for what the council called aggressive expansion into space that belonged to older species who had claimed it. Thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire, the 17 worlds were home to over 40 million human colonists who had spent decades building cities and farms and schools and hospitals, and now the council wanted to just hand all of that over to the Veltari, who would almost certainly kick all the humans out and take everything they had. Rebecca felt anger rising in her chest like hot lava. It's pushing up through a volcano, and she gripped the edges of her podium so hard that her knuckles turned white, and she had to force herself to breathe slowly and count to 10 in her head before she could trust herself to speak. She looked around the room at all the alien faces staring at her, and she saw no sympathy or understanding in any of them, and she realized that these species did not see humans as equals or even as people worth respecting, and they saw humans as primitives who got lucky and found faster than light travel by accident, and who needed to be controlled and managed like children. Sessa spoke next, and her 3 eyes blinked one after another in a pattern that Rebecca had learned meant dismissal and contempt. And Thesa said that humanity needed to understand that the galaxy had rules and order that existed long before Earth joined. The council and humans could not just ignore thousands of years of tradition and territorial agreements just because they wanted more space for their growing population. Rebecca wanted to scream at them that those 17 worlds were empty when humans found them, and that no species had set foot on them for over 10,000 years, and that the Veltari only wanted them now because humans had made them valuable by building infrastructure and establishing trade routes. But she had tried those arguments before, and the council did not care about facts or logic when it came to dealing with humanity, and they had already made up their minds, and nothing Rebecca said would change that. So instead, Rebecca reached down and pressed a button on her communication device, and she spoke clearly into the microphone and said the words she'd been practicing for weeks, and she told Earth Command to begin Protocol Exodus. The room went completely silent, and even the gas star delegates, who usually made a constant humming sound, stopped their noise, and everyone stared at Rebecca like she had just announced that Earth was going to explode. Matriarch recovered first, and she stood up straighter, and her robes turned bright red, which meant anger and shock, and she said that no species could simply leave the council, and that it was not allowed, and that there would be severe consequences if humanity tried to walk away. Becca smiled for the first time in months, and it was not a nice smile. And it was the kind of smile that made the aliens in the room suddenly remember that humans had spent thousands of years fighting wars against each other before they ever reached space, and that maybe having humans as friends was better than having them as enemies. Rebecca gathered up her papers and files, and she put them carefully into her bag, while the council chamber erupted into chaos, with delegates shouting and arguing and demanding that Earth be punished for this insult. Other human delegates stood up and followed Rebecca toward the exit, and their footsteps echoed through the huge room. And none of them looked back at the council that had treated them like dirt for 3 years. As Rebecca reached the door, she heard Thesis shout something about sanctions and blockades. But Rebecca did not care anymore, because Earth had tried to play by the rules and be respectful and diplomatic, and it had gotten them nothing but demands and disrespect. The human delegation walked through the corridors of the council station, and other aliens moved out of their way and stared at them with expressions ranging from shock to anger to something that might have been fear. When they reached the docking bay, their ships were already prepared and waiting, with engines warming up in cruise, ready to depart, and Rebecca climbed aboard her vessel and strapped into her seat and watched through the viewport as the station grew smaller behind them. Within 1 hour, every human ship had left the council station and was heading back toward Earth space, and Rebecca knew that this was just the beginning, and that the real challenges were still ahead. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt like humanity had taken control of its own destiny instead of waiting for permission from species that would never respect them. Commander Lissa stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the tactical display with growing concern as red enemy markers appeared on the screen, like drops of blood spreading across a white cloth, and each one represented a Krellian warship, pushing deeper into territory that the Elven fleet had protected for over 200 years without losing a single major battle. The Krellians were not supposed to be this strong or this coordinated, and they had always been a threat on the borders of council space, but they attacked in small groups and raided isolated outposts and supply convoys, and then retreated before the council could respond with overwhelming force. But this was different, and this was a full-scale invasion with hundreds of ships working together in formations that showed planning and intelligence that the Krellians had never demonstrated before. And Lissa felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized her fleet was in serious danger. Tactical officer was a younger elf named Kira, who had earned her position through decades of study and simulation training, and Kira looked at the display with her mouth open in shock, and her pointed ears were pressed flat against her head, which was a sign of extreme stress in their species. Kira asked how the Krellians were adapting so quickly to every tactic the Elven fleet used, and it was a good question because the elves would change their formation or adjust their approach, and within minutes, Krellians would counter it perfectly, like they knew exactly what the elves were going to do before they did. Lissa knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt like admitting a terrible mistake that her people had made, and she said quietly that the humans were no longer sharing their tactical databases with the council for 3 years, while humanity had been part of the council. They had uploaded massive amounts of military data and strategic analysis and battle simulations and security protocols, and they did this every single day without asking for anything in return, and the council had accepted all of this information without really thinking about how much they were starting to depend on it. The humans had also run constant cyber warfare drills and security checks, and they had found and fixed hundreds of vulnerabilities in the council networks, and they had warned about the risks of data leaks and poor encryption. But the other species had thought the humans were being paranoid and overly cautious. Now the council networks were full of holes, and someone leaked critical information to the Krellians, and the enemy knew exactly where the council fleets were positioned, when they would be vulnerable, and how to exploit the weaknesses in Elven defensive tactics. Lissa watched as another section of her fleet took heavy damage, and ships that had served for centuries were being torn apart by Krellian weapons, and she could see the names of those ships on her display, and she knew the commanders and crew members who were dying right now. She gave orders to her fleet to fall back to a defensive position near a cluster of asteroids where they might be able to use the terrain to their advantage. But the Krellians anticipated this move and cut off the retreat. Pathan forced the Elven ships into a killing zone. Kira reported that they had lost 30% of the fleet and casualties were climbing rapidly. And at this rate, they would be completely destroyed within a few hours, and Lissa made the hardest decision of her life and ordered a priority distress call to be sent to the council headquarters. The response came back faster than Lissa expected, but the message was not what she hoped to hear, and the council said that reinforcements could not arrive in time because Krellian forces were attacking 6 different sectors simultaneously, and every available ship was already engaged in combat. Lissa realized with horrible clarity that this was a coordinated assault designed to stretch the council forces too thin, and the Krellians had probably been planning this for months or even years, and they had waited until humanity left before launching their attacks. She thought about the human delegates and how the council had treated them with contempt and dismissal and demanded that they give up their colonies, and now those same humans were probably back on Earth, watching the news reports of the council getting destroyed, and maybe they were happy about it. Lissa's ship shook violently as a Krellian torpedo hit the shields, and the lights flickered and alarms started blaring throughout the bridge, and damage reports flooded in from multiple sections, and she knew they did not have much time left. She closed her eyes and thought about her family back on the home world, and she hoped they would understand that she had done her best, and that sometimes your best was not enough. When you were facing an enemy that had better information and better preparation than every alarm on the bridge started screaming at once, and Kira shouted that new contacts were appearing on sensors, and Lissa opened her eyes, expecting to see more Krellian ships arriving to finish them off. But signatures were wrong, and these ships were not Krellian, and they were human vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a perfect defensive formation between the Elven fleet and the attacking Lenstheer were 12 human warships, and they were not flying council colors or displaying the Union banner, and instead they had Earth flags painted on their hulls and names like Defiant and Indomitable and Remember Sitnier. A voice came over the communication channel, and it belonged to a human woman who identified herself as Captain Morrison of the United Earth ship Defiant, and she said in a calm, professional tone that they were here to help whether the elves wanted it or not. Lissa wanted to cry with relief, but she was a commander and she had to maintain control. So she just gripped her chair and watched as the human ships engaged. The Krellians to humans did not fight like the elves with elegant maneuvers and carefully choreographed formations, and they did not fight like they were performing a dance that had been practiced for centuries. Instead, they fought like wild animals protecting their territory, and they used brutal, aggressive tactics that focused on maximum damage in minimum time, and they did not care if their ships took heavy hits as long as they destroyed the enemy. The Krellians seemed shocked by this approach, and they had been winning against the careful, methodical Elven tactics, but the humans gave them no time to adapt or respond, and within minutes, the Krellian formation started falling apart. The human ships worked together with precision that came from countless battles, and they covered each other and protected damaged vessels and focused fire on priority targets, and slowly but surely they turned the tide of the battle. 3 hours later, the Krellians retreated and left behind debris and bodies floating in space, and the Elven fleet had survived but barely, and over half their ships were severely damaged. Lissa opened a channel to the human flagship, and Captain Morrison appeared on the screen, and she was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and tired eyes and scars on her face that spoke of many years in combat. Lissa asked the only question that mattered, and she asked why the humans had come to help after everything the council had done to them. Morrison looked directly at Lissa and said simply that it was the right thing to do, and that politics between governments did not mean civilians should die then. Morrison ended the transmission, and the human fleet began helping with rescue operations and pulling survivors from damaged ships. News spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and within days every species in the council knew that the Krellians had launched a massive coordinated invasion, and that the defenses were failing, and that billions of lives were at risk. On the gas star homeworld, an elderly female named Melissa floated through the crystal spires of her city and watched as evacuation ships lifted off carrying refugees to safer systems, and she had lived for 6,000 years and had never seen her people afraid until now. The gas star were a peaceful species made of translucent energy, held together by complex magnetic fields, and they had no weapons and no military, and no concept of violence because they had not needed such things for thousands of generations. When the Krellian ships arrived in orbit around the gas star colonies, they did not negotiate or demand surrender, and they simply opened fire on the defenseless cities below and killed 3 billion. Gas star. In less than a week, Melissa watched through sensors as the Krellian soldiers landed on her world and began destroying everything they found, and the gas star could not fight back because they had no way to harm physical beings, and all they could do was flee or die. She had voted against humanity in the council chambers, and she had supported the decision to demand that humans give up their colonies because she thought humans were too violent and too aggressive and too focused on military power now. She understood that violence had a purpose, and that military power was not just about conquest and aggression, and sometimes having ships with weapons was the only thing standing between civilization and destruction. Human vessels appeared above the gas star homeworld, just as the Krellians were preparing their final assault, and Melissa watched as those human ships engaged an enemy force 3 times their size. The humans did not hesitate or calculate odds or debate the morality of intervention, and they just attacked with everything they had and fought like creatures possessed by fury. Melissa saw human ships take terrible damage and keep fighting, and she saw crews sacrifice themselves to buy time for gas star evacuation vessels to escape, and she saw Captain Morrison's flagship ram a Krellian dreadnought after its weapons were destroyed just to keep it away from a refugee convoy. When the battle ended, the Krellians had been driven off, but the cost had been devastating, and the human fleet had lost 5 ships and over 2,000 crew members, who died protecting aliens that had treated humanity with contempt. Melissa drifted through space to one of the damaged human vessels, and she phased through the hull using her energy form and found survivors trying to repair critical systems and treat wounded crew members. She found Captain Morrison in the medical bay getting treatment for burns on her arms and face, and Melissa floated in front of her and asked why humans would sacrifice so much for a species that had never shown them kindness. Morrison looked at her with eyes that were red from smoke and exhaustion and said that her people fought because letting innocents die was wrong, regardless of politics, and that every life mattered whether it was human or alien. Melissa realized that humans understood something the council had forgotten, which was that peace was not the absence of violence, but rather the willingness to stand against those who would harm the innocent across the galaxy. Similar scenes played out in dozens of systems, and human ships appeared wherever the Krellians attacked, and each time they fought against impossible odds to protect species that had dismissed them on the Veltari homeworld. Thisa watched reports coming in from the front lines, and her 3 eyes tracked different screens simultaneously as she tried to make sense of the chaos of the Veltari. Military was one of the strongest in the council, with advanced weapons and well-trained soldiers, but they were being overwhelmed because the Krellians knew exactly where and when 2 strike supply lines were cut and ammunition depots were destroyed before reinforcements could arrive, and communication networks were hacked and filled with false information that sent fleets to the wrong locations. The finally admitted what she had been denying for weeks, which was that the council's entire infrastructure had been built on a foundation of human expertise that no one had appreciated until it was gone. She thought about the human delegates and how she had looked down on them and dismissed her warnings about security vulnerabilities. And now her people were paying the price for that arrogance. A priority message arrived from the Veltari Forward Command, and Thisa opened it expecting another disaster report, but instead she found something unexpected. Human vessels had engaged Krellian forces at the Battle of 3 Suns, and had stopped an invasion fleet that was heading directly toward the Veltari core worlds, and the humans had lost heavily, but they had held the line. Thisa stared at the report and tried to understand why humans would protect the very species that had demanded they surrender their colonies and had treated them like primitives. She accessed the communication logs and listened to recordings of human commanders coordinating their defense, and in every conversation, they talked about duty and protecting innocent lives, and doing what was right there. There was no mention of revenge or letting the council suffer, or any of the pettiness that Thesa would have expected from a species that had been wronged so badly. She realized that humans operated on principles that went beyond politics and self-interest, and that they had a moral code that demanded they help those in need even when it would be easier to walk away. Thesa made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month ago, and she opened a secure channel directly to Earth and requested to speak with whoever was coordinating the human rescue operations. The response came from Admiral Jackson, who commanded Earth's Rapid Response Fleet, and he was a man in his 60s with white hair and a face lined with decades of command. Decisions. Thesa said that the Veltari needed help and that her people were dying, and that she understood humans had no reason to help after everything the Council had done, but she was asking anyways. Jackson looked at her for a long moment, and Thesa saw anger in his eyes, but also something else that might have been compassion. And he said that human ships would be dispatched immediately to reinforce Veltari positions. Thesa asked why he would help, and Jackson said that his daughter had died on one of the colonies. The Council demanded human surrender, and that he had every reason to hate the Veltari, but letting civilians die to satisfy his anger would dishonor his daughter's memory. The transmission ended, and Thesa sat in silence and understood that she had misjudged humanity completely, and that their strength came not from weapons or tactics, but from values that made them willing to sacrifice for others within. Ours human reinforcements arrived at Veltari worlds and began coordinating with local forces, and they brought not just weapons but also cybersecurity experts who started fixing the compromised networks, and tactical advisors who helped reorganize the chaotic defense. Tides slowly began to turn, but everyone knew it was too late to win without a major change, and the Council was losing ground. Every day and soon the Krellians would push deep enough to threaten the core worlds where trillions lived. Rebecca received the message while she was reviewing casualty reports from the latest human rescue operation, and the numbers made her sick. Because over 8,000 human crew members had died in the past month protecting aliens who had never respected them. Message was from the Galactic Council itself, and it was marked with the highest priority seal, and it formally requested that Ambassador Rebecca return to the Council chambers for an emergency session. Rebecca almost deleted it without responding, because she had no interest in listening to more demands or insults from species that had learned nothing from their mistakes. Admiral Jackson contacted her privately and said that the Council was desperate, that this might be humanity's chance to force real change, and that sometimes you had to negotiate with people you did not like in order to achieve something greater. So, Rebecca packed her bags and boarded a diplomatic shuttle and made the long journey back to the Council station. In the entire trip, she rehearsed what she would say, how she would handle whatever trap the Council might be setting when her ship docked at the station. She noticed immediately that things had changed, and the security forces that used to swagger around with arrogance now looked tired and scared, and they moved aside quickly when they saw human uniforms. The corridors that had once been immaculate were now showing signs of neglect and damage from recent Krellian raids that had gotten within striking distance of the station. Rebecca walked into the Council chamber and found it transformed from the last time she had stood there, and where once there had been 200 species represented, now there were barely half that number, because many had pulled their delegates back to defend their homeworld. Elven matriarch stood in the center of the room, but she looked diminished somehow, and her silver hair no longer shimmered with magical light, and her robes were plain and dark, and her eyes showed exhaustion that came from weeks without sleep. Commander Lissa was there as well, standing beside the matriarch, and when she saw Rebecca, she nodded with genuine respect, and Rebecca nodded back, because Lissa had fought beside human crews and earned their trust. Thesa was also present, and her 3 eyes looked at Rebecca with an expression that was completely different from the contempt she had shown before, and now there was something that might have been shame or regret. Matriarch spoke first, and her voice no longer filled the room with magical resonance, and instead, she just sounded like a tired woman who had seen her people die and her civilization crumble. She said that the Council wished to discuss humanity's return, and Rebecca interrupted immediately and said that Earth was not interested in returning to a council that had treated them so poorly. The chamber went silent, and Rebecca could see shock on many faces because ambassadors did not interrupt the matriarch, and they did not refuse council invitations. But Rebecca had learned that respect had to be earned, could not be demanded, and she was done playing games with species that only valued humans when they needed something. Assess stepped forward, and her voice was quiet and respectful as she explained that the council was not offering humanity's old position back, and instead they were requesting that humans assume a leadership role in council security and military operations. Studied the faces around her, and she saw fear and desperation, but also something that had not been there before, which was genuine respect for what humanity had accomplished. The matriarch continued and explained that the Krellians had attacked 40 systems in the past month, and that without human tactical support and cybersecurity expertise, the council could not coordinate an effective defense. She admitted that intelligence networks had been compromised and supply lines disrupted and communication systems hacked, and that the council was facing total annihilation if things did not change. Rebecca asked where this concern had been when the council demanded humans surrender 17 colonies, and the matriarch flinched at the question, but did not look away. Thessa spoke again, and she said words that Rebecca had never expected to hear from her, and she said that the council had been wrong about humanity, and that they had treated humans as barbaric warmongers, when in reality, humans understood something crucial about survival that the other species had forgotten. She said that violence was not the same as evil, and that having military strength did not make a species primitive, and that sometimes the willingness to fight was what separated civilization from extinction. Melissa, the Gastar elder, floated forward, and her translucent form pulsed with emotion as she spoke, and she said that her species had not known war in 6,000 years, and that they thought themselves beyond such concerns. She described how the Krellians had slaughtered 3 billion Gastar before human ships arrived and drove them back, and she said that her people owed their continued existence to humans who had no obligation to save them. Rebecca felt her resolve weakening because she could see genuine remorse in these beings, and she thought about the human crews who had died protecting them, and she wondered what those crews would want her to do. She thought about Captain Morrison, who had rammed her ship into a Krellian dreadnought to save Gastar refugees, and about Admiral Jackson, who sent help to the Veltari despite losing his daughter because of them. Those humans had not fought for revenge or glory, and they had fought because protecting innocence was the right thing to do. And now Rebecca had to decide if she would honor their sacrifice by helping to rebuild something better. Rebecca spoke carefully and laid out her terms for humanity's return, and she said that humans would only come back as equals, with full council representation and equal votes on all matters, and complete autonomy over their territorial expansion. Matriarch agreed immediately, without hesitation or debate. Rebecca continued and said that there must be mandatory integration of human tactical
doctrine
across all council fleets and comprehensive cybersecurity overhauls using human protocols and standards again. The matriarch agreed. Rebecca added one more requirement, and this one was personal. And she said that the council must issue a formal apology to the families of every human who died defending council space after humanity left, and that apology must acknowledge that their sacrifice came despite the council's betrayal. The chamber remained silent for a long moment, and Rebecca could see the matriarch struggling with the political implications of such an admission, but then the matriarch nodded slowly and said in a voice barely above a whisper that the council agreed to all terms. Rebecca pulled out her communication device and sent the message to Earth Command that would begin protocol homecoming and bring humanity back into the galactic community, but this time on human terms. She stood in that vast chamber, surrounded by aliens, would finally learn to see humans as equals. Rebecca understood that this moment would define the future of the galaxy. Humanity had proven that true strength was not about dominating others, but about standing up for what was right, even when it cost everything, and about being willing to help those in need, even when they did not deserve it. The other species had learned that lesson through blood and fire and loss, and now they understood that humans were not primitive warmongers, but rather a people with a moral code that demanded they protect the innocent, regardless of personal cost. Becca knew there would be challenges ahead, that some species would resent humanity's new position, and that rebuilding trust would take time, but she also knew that humans had earned this moment through sacrifice and courage, and by proving their values were not negotiable. 6 months. After humanity's return to the Council, the galaxy looked completely different than it had before, and the changes went far deeper than just military organization and security protocols. Admiral Jackson stood in the newly established Joint Defense Command Center and watched as officers from 24 different species worked together at stations that humans had designed and built. The center was located on a neutral station that orbited between Earth space and Elven territory, and it represented a compromise that would have been impossible before the Krellian invasion. Jackson saw Commander Lissa working with a human, a tactical officer named Jennifer, who was teaching her advanced cyber warfare techniques. And the two had become friends after fighting together at the Battle of Threshold Nebulat, another station. Thesa was coordinating supply line logistics with a human named Michael, who had lost his brother during the rescue of Veltari. Colonists and Jackson had worried that Michael would refuse to work with Thesa, but instead the young man treated her with professional courtesies. Jackson understood that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and that many humans still felt anger about how the Council had treated them, but they were choosing to focus on building something better rather than nursing old wounds. The door to Jackson's office opened, and Rebecca entered carrying a data pad filled with reports from the front lines, and she looked tired but satisfied. She told Jackson that the Krellian advance had been stopped completely, and that Council forces were beginning to push back and reclaim lost territory, and that intelligence suggested the enemy leadership was fractured and arguing about whether to continue the war. Jackson asked how the integrated command structure was working, and Rebecca smiled and said, "Better than anyone had expected." She explained that human tactical doctrine was being adapted by other species in ways that improved upon the original concepts, and that aliens were teaching humans things about energy manipulation and faster-than-light navigation that humans had never considered. The combination of human military expertise with elven magical abilities and Veltari technological innovation was creating a defense force far stronger than anything that had existed before. Rebecca mentioned that the Council had officially apologized to the families of fallen human soldiers, and that the ceremony had been broadcast across the entire galaxy, and that many species had added their own apologies and expressions of gratitude. Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders because he had attended too many funerals for young people who died protecting aliens that hated them, and knowing that their sacrifice was finally recognized meant something. On the Elven homeworld, the matriarch met with her senior advisors in a garden that had stood for 10,000 years, and she listened as they reported on the progress of the war and the integration of human forces into Valvan command structures. One advisor complained that humans were too aggressive and too quick to use overwhelming force when elegant solutions might work better. Matriarch cut him off and reminded him that elegant solutions had failed against the Krellians, and that human aggression was the reason Elven civilians were still alive. She had learned humility the hard way, and had watched her people die because she thought they were too civilized to need the brutal tactics that humans specialized in. Another advisor asked if the matriarch was concerned about humans gaining too much influence in Council affairs and whether humanity might use their new position to dominate other species. The matriarch considered the question carefully because it was a legitimate concern, and humanity now controlled much of the Council's military and security infrastructure. But she thought about Captain Morrison, who died ramming her ship into an enemy vessel to save Gastar refugees, and about Admiral Jackson, who helped the Veltari despite personal loss, and about Rebecca, who could have demanded revenge but instead negotiated for partnership. She told her advisors that humans had proven their character through actions, it's not words, and that every species in the Council owed their continued existence to human sacrifice. She said that if humanity wanted to dominate the galaxy, they could have let the Krellians destroy the Council and then swept in to claim everything that remained, but instead they had fought and died to save their former enemies. The advisors fell silent because they could not argue with that logic on the Gastar homeworld. Melissa floated through the reconstructed city center and marveled at how quickly humans had helped rebuild what the Krellians destroyed. Human engineers had worked alongside Gastar, energy specialists, to create new buildings that combined human structural design with Gastar aesthetic preferences. Visited a memorial that honored the 3 billion Gastar who died in the invasion, and next to it stood another memorial that honored the humans who died defending Gastar World's young Gastar. Gathered at the human memorial every day and left offerings of energy crystals and holographic flowers, and many of them had never met a human, but understood that they owed their lives to human sacrifice. Melissa thought about how her species had voted to punish humanity for being too militaristic, and how that vote had nearly led to Gastar extinction. She had learned that peace required guardians, and that sometimes the most violent species were the ones most committed to protecting the innocent in Earth. Rebecca returned home for the first time in months, walked through streets that looked different than when she left, because everywhere she looked she saw aliens living and working alongside humans. The Council had opened Earth to immigration and trade, and thousands of aliens were coming to human worlds to learn military tactics and security protocols, and to teach humans about their own specialties. Rebecca visited a school where human children sat next to elven children and Veltari children, and they learned together and played together, did not carry the prejudices of their parents. Generation she watched a human teacher explaining Earth history to alien students, and she listened as the teacher talked about humanity's violent past and the wars that had shaped human culture. The alien students asked why humans fought so much, and the teacher explained that humans learned through conflict, that peace was precious and worth defending, and that violence in defense of the innocent was different than violence for conquest. Rebecca realized that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not tactical expertise or cybersecurity, but rather the understanding that strength existed to protect weakness, and that those who could fight had a duty to fight for those who could not. Tap the Joint Defense Command. Jackson received a priority alert and saw that a new threat had appeared on the TRC border of Council space, and this time it was not the Krellians, but something else entirely. He activated the emergency response protocols that humans had designed, and watched as the integrated defense force responded with speed and coordination that would have been impossible a year ago. Human ships jumped into formation alongside elven vessels and Veltari cruisers and Dostar support craft, and they moved as a unified force toward the threat. Jackson opened a channel to all fleet commanders, and his message was simple and direct, and it said that the Council protected all member species equally, and that any threat to one was a threat to all. The response came back from dozens of voices representing dozens of species, and they all said the same thing, which was that they were ready to defend the Council and each other. Jackson smiled because this was what humanity had fought for. This was worth every sacrifice and every loss. The galaxy had changed, and the Council was no longer a collection of species competing for dominance, but rather a true alliance built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. Humans not conquered the galaxy through force, and they had not demanded submission from weaker species. Instead, they had shown through actions that protecting others was more important than protecting yourself, and that doing the right thing mattered even when it was hard. The other species had learned this lesson and embraced it, and now the galaxy was stronger for it. Rebecca stood in the Council chamber months later and looked around at faces that showed respect and gratitude and friendship. Matriarch approached her privately after the session and thanked her for giving the Council a second chance and for not letting past wrongs prevent future cooperation. Rebecca told the Matriarch that humans believed in redemption and second chances, and that people could change if they were willing to admit their mistakes. She said that the Council had been wrong about humanity, but they had acknowledged that error and worked to fix it, and that took courage. The Matriarch asked what humanity wanted from the galaxy. Now that they held so much influence and power, Rebecca thought about all the humans who died defending aliens they did not know, and she thought about the values that drove them to sacrifice everything for strangers.